In the name of Jesus.
Amen.
As some of you know, I've spent a lot of time in recent years trying to understand trauma and how trauma works. Books have helped a little, but I've learned much more from some men and women who have lived with it and talked to me about their experience. Like a man I met a while back. He grew up a Lutheran and joined the army and saw some really brutal combat in the war in which he fought, and ended up with what we now call PTSD. Pretty bad. And I asked him once where he was with his faith since the war, and he wasn't really sure. One problem, he said, is that he had done so many of the things that his faith had taught him to believe were wrong. That was what his experience was. He didn't go into a lot of detail. The little that he did say was bad enough. I won't repeat it here. But we know what he means. From the time that we're babies, we're trying to figure this place out. We're trying to learn who we are and how the world is supposed to work. And so we create these pictures in our heads. And we learn simple truths like if you work hard, you'll succeed. Or if you obey the rules, you won't get in trouble. Or if you're nice, people will like you. Or if you act bad, eventually you'll get punished. And these little pictures of reality are not reality, although we may take them as such. They are at best oversimplifications. But we like them because they help us to feel safe and feel good, and they help us figure out what on earth we're supposed to be doing next. Then trauma hits, often as a sudden blow that makes us feel that we are endangered and helpless and terrified. And it just has a way of exploding our soothing sense of who we are and how the world is supposed to work. Our most cherished ideas of what is fair or safe or right just get blown to smithereens. Now, anything can happen. Nothing makes sense. Hence, this weird, unreal feeling of floating and sort of being detached and this urge to hide. Alternatively, and this is what I'm seeing in some of the kids that I'm dealing with in that Chicago school, people grow up in situations that may not always be overtly dangerous or terrifying, but they never really feel safe. And so their lives, too, are largely focused on this constant danger and how to avoid it. And sometimes God gets pulled into this conversation. It is assumed that God made rules, and so he's supposed to enforce them and make the world nice. And sometimes it doesn't work out the way we thought it was supposed to. And this is where St. Paul is today. For him, the faith of his ancestors at one point in his life was the gold standard, and he was an all-star. Just read his bragging rights. Circumcised on the 8th day, from this tribe here. Not only was I a faithful Jew, I was an ultra-faithful Jew. I was a Pharisee. And I was a really good Pharisee. And according to righteousness, according to the law, I was blameless. You couldn't find a crack in my armor. He knew the rules. He knew without fail that he was virtuous and right. And everything he believed told him that Jesus of Nazareth fellow fully deserved to die. And Paul's hatred and anger toward Christians were completely justified. And then one day, while on a business trip to Damascus, Paul sees a man who is supposed to be dead. And that was a serious problem. If that man he saw really was Jesus, and it was, and he was alive, that means that God raised him from the dead and was on his side. And if God is on Jesus' side, then holy whatever. Paul was actually fighting against God. And if he was fighting against God, that means that after a whole lifetime of trying to understand God and serve God, Paul was simply completely dead wrong. And this came as an earthquake or as a death blow. His life was shattered. Have you ever known someone whose life completely fell apart? Every truth that he had built his life on was a lie. Everyone he trusted was a cheat. Conduct that he once viewed as noble ends up being evil. St. Paul's life was like that. It was collapsing. I once read the memoirs of Albert Speer, one of Hitler's top henchmen, and one of the very few actually to regret what he did. Looking back across his life, he has a feeling of sick amazement. He can somehow understand each step that he took that led him to where he ended up, but he still couldn't quite figure out, how did I get here? I've also heard Jeffrey Dahmer's confession, a 2-hour conversation with his dad looking back over what he did. After you have killed and eaten people, and then have seen the error of your ways, how do you survive that? But he did, and was baptized. You know, the truth is, people take their lives sometimes at moments like that. And many people in St. Paul's position sometimes just give up on God. They abandon him and turn away from faith, and Paul didn't. I think this is a big part of what Paul means when he's talking about the loss of all things and sharing Christ's sufferings and becoming like him in his death. A total disillusionment. And while the world is crashing to the ground and the crowds are screaming, there is Jesus right in the middle of it. The one man who truly is sinless is condemned as the worst man in the world. The one who came out of love for the whole human race is on the receiving end of furious hate. The author and giver of life is getting subjected to a miserable death. The true leader of his people is handed over to the enemies of his people by their leaders. God's Son dies while God silently watches it happen. On and on, Jesus' death is portrayed to us as this sick perversion of everything that a person might think right, proper, and holy. It looks like the utter denial of everything we thought was right about the world. Think of the worst recent news stories you know, where the good guy gets trounced and the bad guy comes out healthy, tanned, rich, and laughing with the beautiful girl on his arm, and you are just filled with fury. You want to throw something at the TV. That ain't right. And maybe another man beside you shouts, "That's why I don't believe in God." Well, with all due respect, that's a bit shallow and a bit mistaken. The whole point is that when the world turns crazy, as it has a way of doing, and justice is perverted, as it often is, and evil seems to triumph, as seems to happen every day, and our petty little schemes for uplifting and beautifying the universe are thrown to the ground, and we ourselves are exposed as fools at best, or as criminals at worst, there is the Son of God standing right beside us, getting it in the neck, and saying, "I'm getting us out of this." And you say, "But I don't deserve to be gotten out of this." And he says, "I know, I don't care. Stick by me." we're getting out of this. When I was a kid, we had the good china, and we never used it for fear of breaking it. It just sat in the cabinet. And I hate it when our faith is presented as a china cabinet full of lovely but fragile opinions, too delicate to stand up to the blows of reality. That's a total misrepresentation of what our faith is all about. Our faith was born when an innocent man was tortured to death. It was sealed when that man forgave the unforgivable, and believed by people whose own bitter life experience had disillusioned them and destroyed their faith in everything and everyone else, including themselves, and their own wisdom, and their own goodness, and their own strength, and their outlook on life, had destroyed their faith in everything but Jesus. Our faith is not a flight of pretty, uplifting ideas. It is an experience of communion with one who is so loyal that he stands beside us when we are condemned, who is kind enough to stand beside us when we are filled with shame, who is calm enough to lead us when we are terrorized and confused, who is strong enough to pull us from death back into life. And our communion with that Son of God often becomes its deepest when everything we believe to be true of ourselves, our world, and even God goes crashing to the ground. And the only thing still standing is the cross, with Jesus on it, looking straight at us.